February 19, 1943. The wind cut across the rocky ridges of central Tunisia, carrying dust, confusion, and the sound of a battle the United States Army was not ready to fight. In the narrow defile known as the Battle of Kasserine Pass, American forces were about to face a brutal reality. Modern war did not forgive inexperience. Just weeks earlier, many of these soldiers had never seen combat. They had trained in deserts back home, drilled in formations, memorized procedures, but none of that could fully prepare them for what was coming. Across the hills stood a hardened enemy, the Afrika Korps, led by one of Germany's most respected commanders, Erwin Rommel. His troops had fought for years in North Africa. They knew the terrain, they knew the tactics, and they knew exactly how to exploit weakness. And weakness was everywhere. American units were scattered across miles of broken terrain, often poorly coordinated and dangerously exposed. Command structures were unclear, orders were delayed, misunderstood, or contradicted. Some officers were inexperienced, others were simply overwhelmed. Tanks were deployed without proper infantry support. Artillery was mispositioned. Communication lines broke down at the worst possible moments. What should have been a defensive line became a series of isolated pockets, each one vulnerable, each one alone. Then Rommel struck. Using speed, deception, and precision, German forces punched through weak points in the American line. Panzer divisions moved with terrifying efficiency, slipping through gaps and encircling positions before the defenders even understood what was happening. American troops caught off guard, tried to regroup, but the battlefield was already unraveling. Imagine being there. One moment you're holding a position, believing reinforcements are nearby. The next, enemy armor appears where it shouldn't be. Radios crackle with conflicting orders. Officers shout commands that no longer make sense. Dust clouds rise in the distance. Are they friendly forces or advancing panzers? No one knows for sure. Panic begins to spread. Some units fought bravely, holding their ground against overwhelming odds. Others were forced into chaotic retreats, abandoning equipment, vehicles, even wounded comrades. Entire formations collapsed under pressure, not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because the system around them had failed. War at this scale required coordination, experience, and leadership, and in those critical hours, all three were in short supply. The geography of Kasserine Pass only made things worse. Narrow and rugged, it funneled troops into confined spaces, limiting maneuverability and amplifying confusion. When German forces broke through, there was little room to fall back in an organized way. Retreat quickly turned into disorder. Over the course of just 6 days, the cost became staggering. Around 6,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Dozens of tanks destroyed or abandoned, supplies lost, positions overrun. It was one of the most painful defeats the U.S. Army would suffer in World War II. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real damage was psychological. For many American soldiers, this was their first taste of combat, and it was a nightmare. The confidence built during training shattered under the pressure of real warfare. The belief that superior equipment and numbers would guarantee victory suddenly seemed dangerously naive. They had faced an enemy who was faster, smarter, and more experienced, and they paid the price. Back in command centers, the shock was just as severe. Reports coming in from the front painted a grim picture: disorganization, miscommunication, and a failure to respond effectively to a highly mobile enemy. It became clear that something fundamental had to change. The U.S. Army could not afford another Kasserine. And yet, hidden within the chaos, there were lessons, hard, painful lessons that would shape the future of the American war effort. Officers began to understand the importance of unified command, the need for better coordination between infantry, armor, and air support, the value of rapid decision-making in fluid situations. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were matters of survival. Even the enemy took notice. Rommel, analyzing the battle, recognized both the weaknesses and the potential of the American forces. He saw soldiers who were green but not incapable, units that faltered but did not completely break. Beneath the confusion, there was resilience, and that made them dangerous, if they learned. But at that moment, in late February 1943, the battlefield told a different story. Burning vehicles dotted the landscape. Abandoned positions marked the path of retreat. Survivors regrouped, exhausted and shaken, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The defeat at Kasserine was not just a tactical setback, it was a wake-up call. The question now was simple and urgent. Could the United States Army recover from this humiliation, or would this be the moment that defined its limits? Because somewhere beyond the dust and defeat, change was already coming. In the aftermath of the defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, as American forces struggled to regroup and understand what had gone wrong, someone on the other side of the battlefield was already thinking several moves ahead. Erwin Rommel, the man the Allies would come to know as the Desert Fox, was not celebrating in the way many might expect. He was studying. Rommel had seen victories before. He had outmaneuvered British forces across North Africa, pushed them back again and again, and built a reputation for speed, precision, and boldness. But Kasserine was different. This wasn't just another win. It was a glimpse into the future, and what he saw didn't make him comfortable. He understood something many in the German high command did not. The Americans were inexperienced, yes, but they were not weak. From captured documents, intercepted communications, and battlefield observation, Rommel began to piece together a picture of his new enemy. He saw units that had broken under pressure, but also units that had fought stubbornly even when surrounded. He saw confusion, but also moments of initiative. There was raw potential there, hidden beneath poor coordination and flawed leadership. And potential in war was dangerous. Rommel reportedly warned that the Americans would not remain disorganized for long. They had industrial power, manpower, and the ability to adapt quickly. If they found the right leadership, someone aggressive, disciplined, and relentless, they could transform into a force that would be extremely difficult to stop. This was not speculation, it was a calculation. Because Rommel knew what effective leadership looked like. He had built his own success on speed, clarity of command, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. And as he analyzed the American failures at Kasserine, he began to imagine what would happen if those same principles were applied to U.S. forces. What if the chaos disappeared? What if the hesitation was replaced with aggression? What if the scattered units became a unified, fast-moving machine? That was the real threat. Not the Americans he had just defeated, but the Americans they could become. Some intelligence reports even pointed to rising officers within the U.S. ranks, commanders known for strict discipline and bold tactics, names that hadn't yet made headlines but were beginning to stand out. Rommel paid attention to these details. He understood that wars were not only fought with tanks and guns, but with minds, and the right commander could change everything. But here's where the story takes a critical turn. Rommel's concerns were not fully shared by his superiors. Far from the deserts of Tunisia, within the rigid structure of the German high command, a different narrative was taking hold. Many believed the Americans were fundamentally inferior on the battlefield. To them, Kasserine Pass confirmed their assumptions: poorly trained troops, weak coordination, and a lack of combat experience, a temporary threat at best. There was confidence, too much of it. Warnings about future American capability were often dismissed or downplayed. The idea that the U.S. Army could rapidly transform into a highly effective fighting force seemed unlikely to those who underestimated the speed of adaptation and the scale of American resources. After all, they had just been defeated decisively. Why expect anything different next time?
This disconnect between frontline reality and high-level perception would prove costly. Rommel, operating closer to the ground truth, understood that war was dynamic, enemies evolved, mistakes were corrected, weaknesses could become strengths faster than expected. But his ability to influence broader strategy was limited. He could warn, he could advise, but he could not force others to see what he saw. And time was not on Germany's side. Even as Rommel continued operations in North Africa, dealing with supply shortages and increasing Allied pressure, the Americans were already beginning to change. Lessons from Kasserine were being analyzed, reports were being written, decisions were being made behind the scenes. The process of transformation had already begun, quietly but decisively. Rommel sensed it. He knew that the next time he faced American forces, they would not be the same army he had routed in the mountain passes. They would be more organized, more aggressive, and far more dangerous. The window of easy victories was closing. But the German High Command, confident in past success, did not fully adjust. And that miscalculation, this gap between warning and belief, set the stage for what would come next. Because somewhere in the Allied command structure, a new leader was about to step in, a man who embodied exactly the kind of transformation Rommel feared, a commander who would impose order on chaos, discipline on disorder, and aggression on hesitation. Rommel had seen it coming. The question was, would anyone else realize it before it was too late?
The crisis that followed the defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass could not be ignored. Reports of chaos, broken units, and failed leadership reached the highest levels of Allied command, and one conclusion became unavoidable. The American forces in North Africa needed a complete transformation, and they needed it fast. That transformation would begin with a single decision. Into this atmosphere of urgency stepped George S. Patton. Patton was not a typical commander. He was intense, uncompromising, and absolutely convinced that discipline and aggression were the foundations of victory. Where others saw shaken troops and disorganized units, he saw something else entirely, raw material that could be forged into a weapon. But first, he had to take control. When Patton arrived to assume command of the U.S. Second Corps, what he found confirmed the worst fears of Allied leadership. Soldiers were demoralized, standards had slipped, uniform regulations were ignored, equipment was poorly maintained, units lacked coordination, and confidence was dangerously low. The defeat at Kasserine had not only exposed tactical weaknesses, it had shaken the identity of the army itself. Patton understood immediately that this was not just a tactical problem, it was psychological, and he moved quickly. His changes began with the smallest details, but carried the weight of something much larger. Soldiers were ordered to wear proper uniforms at all times, including ties and helmets, even behind the lines. Vehicles had to be cleaned and maintained to strict standards. Inspections became constant and unforgiving. At first, these rules seemed excessive, even unnecessary. But Patton wasn't focused on comfort, he was rebuilding discipline. Because in his mind, discipline created confidence, and confidence won battles. He didn't stop there. He restructured how units operated in the field. He demanded clear chains of command and immediate execution of orders. Hesitation was no longer tolerated. Officers who failed to act decisively were replaced. Training intensified, focusing on coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. Communication procedures were simplified and enforced. Every soldier was expected to understand not just their role, but the mission as a whole. Speed became everything. Patton believed that a fast-moving, aggressive force could overwhelm even a more experienced enemy. He pushed his units to think offensively, to seize initiative rather than react. Instead of waiting for orders under fire, commanders were expected to act, adapt, move, and exploit opportunities in real time. For many soldiers, the shift was shocking. The same army that had retreated in confusion at Kasserine was now being drilled relentlessly under a commander who demanded perfection. There was little room for excuses. Patton was known for his blunt language, his fiery speeches, and his refusal to accept anything less than total commitment. Some feared him, others resented him, but slowly something began to change. The chaos started to fade. Units that had once operated independently began to function as coordinated groups. Tank crews learned to work closely with infantry. Artillery support became more precise and responsive. Communication improved. Orders became clearer. And most importantly, soldiers began to believe that they could stand their ground and win. Patton reinforced this belief at every opportunity. He moved constantly between units, inspecting positions, speaking directly to soldiers, making his presence impossible to ignore. His message was consistent. Defeat was not acceptable, and retreat would happen on his terms. He made it clear that the failures of the past would not define the future, and the soldiers listened. Because beneath the strict discipline and harsh standards, there was a sense of direction that had been missing before. For the first time since arriving in North Africa, many troops felt that they were part of something organized, something purposeful. The uncertainty that had dominated Kasserine was being replaced with structure, and that structure brought confidence. But perhaps the most important change was invisible: mindset. Patton wasn't just training soldiers to follow orders, he was teaching them how to think differently about war. No longer passive, no longer reactive, but aggressive, adaptable, and relentless. Every exercise, every inspection, every demand was shaping a new kind of force, one that Rommel had already feared. And this transformation did not take months. It didn't even take a full campaign. It happened in a matter of weeks. Within 21 days, the U.S. Second Corps was no longer that broken force that had stumbled through the mountain passes. It was becoming something faster, sharper, and far more dangerous. Not perfect, but no longer predictable. Not inexperienced, but rapidly learning. The question now was whether this new force could prove itself in battle, because training grounds and inspections were one thing. Facing the Afrika Korps again was something else entirely. And soon, that test would come.
The transformation of the U.S. Second Corps under George S. Patton did not happen in theory. It had to prove itself under fire. Training, discipline, and strict reforms meant nothing unless they could survive the chaos of the battlefield. And as March 1943 approached, that moment was getting closer. What made this phase remarkable was not just the speed of change, but how deeply the lessons from the Battle of Kasserine Pass were being applied. Every mistake, every failure, every moment of confusion had been analyzed and turned into a correction. The same weaknesses that had nearly broken the American forces were now being systematically eliminated. Coordination became the backbone of everything. Previously, American units had fought almost as separate entities, infantry advancing without armor support, tanks operating without proper reconnaissance, artillery firing without clear targeting. Now, that began to change. Infantry, armor, and artillery were trained to move and fight as a single, unified force. Each element supported the other, covering weaknesses and amplifying strengths. Air power, in particular, started to play a much more effective role. Instead of being used sporadically, it was now integrated into battlefield planning. Communication between ground forces and aircraft improved, allowing for faster and more precise strikes against enemy positions. German movements that might have gone unnoticed before were now detected and targeted. The battlefield was no longer just a ground fight. It became a coordinated, multi-layered system. Speed followed coordination. Under Patton's influence, hesitation had been replaced with action. Units were trained to move quickly, exploit openings, and maintain pressure on the enemy. This wasn't reckless aggression, it was controlled momentum. Commanders were encouraged to think ahead, to anticipate rather than react. The goal was simple: never give the enemy time to recover. and slowly the results began to show. American forces that had once struggled to hold defensive lines were now conducting more organized maneuvers. Patrols became more effective, reconnaissance improved, information flowed more reliably between units. Small engagements, often overlooked in larger narratives, started to reflect a growing confidence. Soldiers who had once been uncertain now moved with purpose. You could see it in the way units deployed, in how quickly they responded to orders, in how they adapted when plans changed. The fear that had defined Kasserine was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had been replaced by something more controlled, more focused. Experience was being built in real time. Every skirmish, every engagement added another layer of understanding. Mistakes still happened, but they were corrected faster. Officers who had once hesitated were now making decisions under pressure. Communication, once unreliable, became more consistent. The Army was learning, not slowly, but at a pace that surprised even its own commanders. And on the other side, the enemy began to notice. Erwin Rommel had predicted this shift. He had warned that the Americans would adapt, that their early failures would not define them. Now, those predictions were starting to take shape. The same forces that had been disorganized weeks earlier were becoming more difficult to read, harder to outmaneuver. They were no longer reacting blindly. They were beginning to think, move, and fight with intention. This change did not mean immediate dominance. The German Afrika Korps was still experienced, still dangerous, still capable of exploiting mistakes. But the balance was shifting. Engagements that might have ended in collapse before were now being held, contested, sometimes even turned in favor of the Americans. Momentum was building. And perhaps the most significant change was not visible on maps or reports. It was internal. Confidence. Not the fragile confidence before Kasserine, built on assumptions and untested training, but a harder, more grounded belief. A belief formed through failure, rebuilt through discipline, and reinforced through action. Soldiers began to trust their training, their officers, and each other. That trust changed everything, because an army that trusts itself can move faster, react better, and endure more. It can take risks when needed and hold firm under pressure. It can recover from setbacks without collapsing. And that is exactly what was beginning to emerge in North Africa. A new kind of American force, one that had been forged in defeat, shaped by relentless reform, and sharpened through constant adaptation. Not perfect, but no longer vulnerable in the same way. Not inexperienced, but rapidly becoming battle-ready. The transformation that Erwin Rommel had feared was no longer a possibility. It was happening. And soon it would face its ultimate test, not in drills, not in small engagements, but in the full force of battle. Because the road from humiliation to victory was not finished yet. It was just beginning to reveal its true direction.
By the time the dust began to settle after the disaster at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the United States Army was no longer the same force that had stumbled into the Tunisian mountains. What had started as a humiliating defeat was now turning into something far more dangerous, a catalyst for transformation. And that transformation was about to be tested on a much larger scale. Under the relentless drive of George S. Patton, the rebuilt U.S. Second Corps began to re-enter the fight, not as a fragmented reactive force, but as a coordinated and increasingly confident army. The lessons learned in blood at Kasserine were no longer theoretical. They were embedded in every movement, every order, every decision made on the battlefield. This time, things were different. When American forces engaged Axis positions again across Tunisia, the chaos that had once defined their operations was noticeably absent. Units advanced with clearer objectives, supported by coordinated artillery and air power. Communication lines held, command structures functioned, and when the unexpected happened, as it always does in war, officers adapted instead of freezing. The difference was immediate. German forces, including elements of the Afrika Korps, began to encounter an opponent that no longer behaved predictably.
Instead of collapsing under pressure, American units resisted, regrouped, and counterattacked. Instead of isolated defenses, they presented layered resistance. Instead of hesitation, there was aggression. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And in war, progress can be decisive. Even the tempo of battle began to shift. Where once the Germans dictated the pace with rapid, decisive strikes, they now faced an enemy that could respond with speed of its own. American forces were beginning to seize initiative, forcing engagements on their terms rather than simply reacting. This subtle shift changed the dynamics of the battlefield, because initiative means control, and control means opportunity. Across the wider North African campaign, Allied forces were tightening their grip. Pressure increased not just from the Americans, but from British and other Allied units advancing from multiple directions. Supply lines for Axis forces grew more strained. Options became more limited. The space to maneuver, the very advantage that commanders like Erwin Rommel had relied on, began to shrink. Rommel had seen it coming. He had understood, even during the victory at Kasserine, that the Americans would adapt, that they would learn faster than expected, that they would return to the battlefield stronger, more disciplined, and far more dangerous. And now, that prediction was becoming reality. But by this point, the momentum was no longer his to control. The transformation of the U.S. Army was not happening in isolation. It was part of a much larger shift in the war. Industrial production back home was accelerating, equipment was improving, training programs were evolving, command structures were being refined. What had been exposed as weakness was being systematically rebuilt into strength. And North Africa was the proving ground. The campaign that once threatened to expose the limits of American military capability was now demonstrating its potential. Not just the ability to fight, but the ability to learn, adapt, and overcome failure. That ability would prove to be one of the most decisive advantages the Allies possessed. Because wars are not won by avoiding mistakes, they are won by responding to them faster than the enemy. Kasserine Pass was a harsh lesson, one paid for with thousands of lives and a blow to national confidence. But it forced change. It demanded accountability. It cleared the way for leaders who could impose order on chaos and turn weakness into strength. Leaders like George S. Patton. His impact extended far beyond those 21 critical days of reform. The standards he enforced, the mindset he instilled, and the aggressive doctrine he championed would influence American operations throughout the rest of the war. From North Africa to Sicily, from France to Germany, the echoes of that transformation would be felt again and again. And it all traced back to a single moment of failure. A moment when everything seemed to collapse. A moment when an experienced enemy, led by Erwin Rommel, delivered a crushing blow and recognized something others did not. That the defeated army in front of him was not at its end, but at its beginning. The warning had been there. The signs had been clear, but it was ignored. And in war, ignoring the truth can be as dangerous as losing a battle. Because from the ashes of Kasserine, a new force had emerged, faster, stronger, and far more capable than anyone had expected. A force that would go on to play a crucial role in the Allied advance across Europe. What began as disaster in the desert had become a turning point in history. Not because of the defeat itself, but because of what came after.